No, I would say there are really two pillars of scientific wisdom that form the entire bedrock and foundation of everything most people believe about nutrition. And even though you may never have thought of these this way, I'm going to state them for you now, and I will posit that most of what you believe about nutrition, most of what you are told about nutrition, most of what you are marketed to about nutrition comes down to one of these two things. The first is that with respect to fat balance, all calories are created equal. Stated another way, some people call it calories in, calories out. Some people call it a calorie is a calorie. I think those are actually technically inaccurate ways to say it. So for an audience like you guys, I'd rather be more technical. The technical piece of foundational wisdom is that the metabolic impact of calories on our body's ability to store and burn fat is independent of where the calorie comes from. Now, you may say, oh, I've never heard that before, but you sort of have, right? It's why we have 100-calorie snack packs of garbage, because, hey, it's just 100 calories. It's why Coca-Cola tells you it's okay to drink Coca-Cola because it's just calories. You just have them in moderation. Don't have 10 Cokes, but you can certainly have 2 Cokes. Because if all calories exert the same metabolic effect, technically 100 calories of broccoli and 100 calories of Coca-Cola, while nobody would dispute that the 100 calories of broccoli may have more nutritional value, they certainly should have the exact same impact on your body's ability to regulate fat tissue. So that's pillar number one, and I agree that that's categorically false. We're not going to talk about that one today, though. The second one is that saturated fat causes heart disease. Now, be honest. How many of you believe saturated fat causes heart disease? And I'm hoping everybody's hand goes up, or else I'm wasting my time here today. If nobody puts their hand up, I can leave, right? How many people think saturated fat causes heart disease? Good. Okay, you should feel that way because you've been force-fed that for as long as you've been alive, for most of you, and certainly as long as you can remember. Okay, I'm going to challenge that one today. Now, again, I want to be really clear. This is not something I could take to the Supreme Court and overturn the AHA and the ACC, okay? What I'm trying to do is make the case that we need to revisit that question, because today that question, in the eyes of the highest powers, is case closed. And it's been case closed since 1977. Okay, so let's talk about the recommendations. So every 5 years, the United States Department of Agriculture, through the Dietary Guidelines Committee, and this has been going on since 1980, so 80, 85, 90, et cetera, releases dietary guidelines. And they're in the process right now of releasing the 2015 guidelines. But the most recent guidelines are here, and I'll let you read them. So the part that I've highlighted here, right, in order to reduce the population's burden from cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and their risk factors, the preponderance of the evidence indicates beneficial health effects are associated with several changes in consumption of dietary fats and cholesterol. This includes limiting saturated fatty acid intake to less than 7% of total calories. It is worth noting that this recommendation has been going down every year. So the original guidelines called for a recommendation below 13%, 11%, 9%, 7%. A more recent guideline, which I'll share with you in a moment, is now requesting that we go below 5% on saturated fat. Those are bold statements. I mean, you'd really want to believe that the evidence is like, it's got to be rock solid, right? Okay, so about a little less than a year ago, in about November of last year, the American Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology, released their guidelines on lifestyle changes for reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, they give each type of recommendation a level of strength. The highest you can get is a grade A. I wanted to quote this directly. A grade A means strong, which means there is a high certainty on the evidence that the net benefit of this recommendation is substantial. The net benefit is defined as a benefit outweighing the risk and harm. And so 2 of the 3 things that were given strong A ratings were aim for a dietary pattern that achieves 5 to 6% of calories from saturated fat and reduce the percent of calories from saturated fat. First of all, those aren't even independent vectors, so it's sort of, as a math guy, that sort of irks me that those are highly overlapping. But nevertheless, the point is clear. We're going to go one better than the DAG. We've got to get saturated fat down to 5 to 6%, and this is the highest possible recommendation we can make, right? We think it's important to wash your hands before surgery. Yes, that's strong. We think it's important to give the right antibiotic to somebody who's dying. Yes, that's strong. And we think this is just as strong. Okay, so let's look at the evidence. Well, when the FAO and World Health Organization wrote a background paper in 2009 examining all of the information, they said the available evidence from cohort and randomized controlled trials is unsatisfactory and unreliable to make judgment about and substantiate the effects of dietary fat on the risk of coronary heart disease. A group from Oakland Children's Hospital under Ron Krauss, who's sort of one of, I guess, sort of the three biggest thought leaders on cardiovascular disease, wrote a meta-analysis in 2010 that said a meta-analysis of prospective epidemiologic studies shows that there is no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease or cerebral vascular disease. And just recently, you may have all seen this actually in the New York Times, this came out in the spring, a very large meta-analysis. In fact, this looked at 49 observational trials with about 500,000 subjects in them and about 27 randomized control trials with more than 100,000 patients. Said current evidence does not clearly support cardiovascular guidelines that encourage high consumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids and low consumption of total saturated fats. In fact, I went back and reread the paper 2 days ago just to refresh my memory. Everybody understand how a relative risk ratio works, what those numbers mean? Like if someone says the relative risk ratio of this is 1.05 with a confidence interval, is it worth me spending a second on what that means, or does everybody know that? Spend the second. Okay. So a relative risk ratio of 1.05 means there is a 5% increase in risk. If it was 1.10, that would be a 10% increase in risk. The confidence interval tells you we are 95% sure that it is between blah and blah. And if that confidence interval overlaps with the number 1, it means it's not actually significant. It's probably chance. Right? So I'm just going to read you the relative risk because they did this with RCTs. They combined basically every RCT and every epidemiologic study. We're going to talk later about why I think epidemiologic studies are not particularly valuable in this regard, and it actually has to do with something Gary said at the outset about time course and severity of disease. But nevertheless, for saturated fat, the relative risk was 1.03. 3% relative risk increase, but the confidence interval was 0.98 to 1.07, so it was not statistically significant, didn't matter. For monounsaturated fats, olive oil, right, it was 1.00. No increase, no decrease in risk, but it also wasn't significant because it was 0.91 to 1.11. For omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, these are the polyunsaturated fats that are primarily found in marine products, so you're going to get this in your fish oils, that sort of thing. That was the only one that showed a reduction of risk, 0.87, so a 13% reduction in risk, and it was 0.78 to 0.97 was the confidence interval, meaning it was legitimately below 1. And I won't get into the others, but N6 or omega-6, the type of polyunsaturated fat found in things like nuts and things like that, actually turned out to be elevated. It was 1.16, and it was significant. So in other words, we're told today, don't eat saturated fat, eat poly and monounsaturated fat, and the most expansive review of the literature says there's actually no evidence to support that. Okay. So I could stop the talk right here, right? But that's not, the question you're asking is, well, you've just created some dissonance, right? I mean, you're telling me that there's a whole bunch of recommendations that are emphatic in what they're saying, and yet you're showing me, at the very least, conflicting evidence, if not outright contradictory evidence. So you know there's got to be a good story behind this. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with the story. In 1951, a nutritionist from the University of Minnesota named Ansel Keys became very interested in a new technology that had just effectively come online, which was a way to measure cholesterol in the blood. So prior to this, we certainly knew that cholesterol existed in the human body. Cholesterol is involved in the formation of every cell in the body. Not having cholesterol in your body, just to be really clear, is incompatible with life. So there are really rare, fortunately very rare genetic disorders that result in failure to metabolize cholesterol properly. These are uniformly fatal, often in utero. So no cholesterol, no life. Let's just get that on the table to begin with. But the question that was really of interest at the time was, what about all this cholesterol in the blood? What do we know about that? And so at the time, there was a way that you could draw somebody's blood, do a chemical assay where you break down the cells after spinning them, and isolate the total amount of cholesterol in the blood. Now, I want to be really clear about something. Cholesterol does not travel through the blood willy-nilly, right? Because blood is like water, and cholesterol is like fat, basically. It's much more complicated, but it's what we call hydrophobic, and so you can't put those two together. They have to be buffered by something and carried by something. So they're carried by things called lipoproteins. So you may have not ever heard of a lipoprotein, but you've all heard of LDL and HDL. Well, what does that stand for? LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. HDL stands for high density lipoprotein. So it's really these lipoproteins that carry everything. But back in this day, they had no clue about any of that stuff. All they knew was there were a bunch of proteins that obviously carried this stuff around. We can break them all down and measure the total content of the cholesterol. So even today, when you go to your doctor and you get a cholesterol panel, you'll notice they do report total cholesterol. And that was the only thing that Ansel Keys could measure in 1951. So Ansel, along with his wife, Margaret, went to Italy, and they assessed cholesterol and fat content of the diet, of workers there within the diet, and they came to a couple of observations. They noticed, hey, the people who are eating more fat and cholesterol, which were the wealthy people, are getting more heart disease. The people who are eating less fat and less cholesterol, the workers, are getting less heart disease. We call that an observation, and they found that very interesting. Well, this obviously sparked what became sort of the dominant theology of the 50s and 60s, which was a series of studies, what are called ecologic studies, that Ansel Keys undertook. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, not because I particularly like doing so. In fact, it kind of annoys me to have to talk about this, but because I think it's so important to understand the story, because it is kind of compelling. Now, what Ansel Keys did was he took a look, and this was published over several years. So the very first one was published in 1957. The final one, I believe, was published in 1970. So I'm going to explain the methodology. The methodology was, we're going to look at every country in the world that for which there are data for two things. One is mortality. We have to know how people die. The second thing we need to know is food availability. How much food is produced per capita, and of what type? So there were 22 countries in the world that met that criteria. Most countries, obviously, you couldn't get both of those. Now, food availability data in and of itself is pretty weak, right? It just says how much food is available in a given country divided by the total number of people. It doesn't actually tell you what they're eating. I mean, today, epidemiologists are more sophisticated, though it's still a far cry from knowing what's actually taking place, because they subtract out food waste from that. And so in theory, you could say, well, this much is created, this much is imported, exported, this much is thrown away. You put the delta of those together and normalize that, you'd have a slightly more accurate assessment of that. But back in the day, this was just food production. The second problem is mortality data. Now, has anybody here ever filled out a death certificate? So I've had to fill out a bunch of these. In fact, this was the bane of every surgical resident, or medical resident for that matter's existence in residency, because filling out death certificates is cumbersome, it's tedious, and it doesn't allow you the flexibility to explain what the person really died of. You have to sort of come up with very nice, neat buckets. So sometimes it's obvious when a person, is tragically hit by a car and killed. You can motor vehicle trauma, right? But many times it's not, right? Many times someone has diabetes and they get into the hospital because they have sepsis and you have to amputate their leg, and while they're there, they have a heart attack, and it's sort of like, did they die of heart disease or diabetes, or was it the sepsis? And maybe they actually had a pulmonary embolism because they actually stopped breathing pretty quick. So it gets very complicated. And we do a pretty good job of this in the US, probably not great. But if you actually go back and look at the records that Ansel Keys looked through, most countries were doing a horrible job of this. They weren't doing autopsies. So it's very hard to know when someone is found not awake in their bed in the morning, you just assume they died of what? I don't know. Heart disease, stroke, I don't know. So I say all this to sort of color the story a bit, to explain that the quality of this analysis wouldn't hold muster today, even amongst an 8th grader trying to do a science fair project. Like I mean, I'm not being facetious. It's literally that low. It's literally that poor in quality. But admittedly, it was the best you could do at the time. Okay. Unfortunately, by the way, the original data have been destroyed, and so it is not possible to go back and repeat this analysis with these data, at least through the statistical analyses. Now, here are the data in their complete form. Each number on here represents a country. So there are the 22 countries for which both of those data sets were available. And on the x-axis, you see percentage of total calories that come from fat. So you've got, Japan over here is remarkable, right? Less than 10% of their total calories come from dietary fat. And of course, you've got the good old US of A up here, where over 40% of our calories came from fat. And on the y-axis, you have cardiac mortality, meaning out of every, and I think it's done on every 10,000, out of every 10,000 deaths in this country, how many are attributed to heart disease? Again, or it's per 1,000 maybe. No, I think it's per 10,000 on this axis. It's per 1,000 over here. So, in other words, this says, based on what the death certificate said, how many of these people are dying of heart disease and how much fat are they eating? So let's look at the data. I think there's a pattern there, right? I mean, I think it's safe to say the more fat in your diet, the more likely you are to die of heart disease. The less fat in your diet, the less likely you are to die of heart disease. Now, Ansel Keys never published the analysis this way, and he's been accused many times over of cherry-picking the data and only picking the best 7 that made that curve. And hence, this was referred to as initially the 5-country study, and ultimately in 1970, the 7-country study. So the 7-country study is this line here. And admittedly, it looks a heck of a lot better when you pick the best ones on the line. But in fairness to Ansel Keys, the correlation, though not as strong, still existed here. Okay, so let's talk about that. 2 things that most people don't know. The first I've already shared with you, which is all of the methodologic stuff. The second thing most people don't know is whether you looked at the entire population or a subset of it, mortality for heart disease turned out to be higher the more fat you ate. Mortality for every other disease known to mankind turned out to be lower. Meaning, the more fat you ate, the less likely you were to die of cancer, the less likely you were to die of an infectious disease, the less likely you were to die of pick your other complication. Now, you could also argue that, well, if heart disease is prevalent enough, it becomes an X1 minus X problem. Fair enough. The other thing I think worth noting here is, if you guys had John Ioannidis here a year ago, you guys got schooled in this, so it really only requires sort of a 30-second explanation is, does everybody understand what we mean by correlation? And everybody hears the term correlation does not apply causation, but I think it's worth spending like a minute on that. So a correlation is a mathematical way to describe a relationship. It means that 2 variables, and you can have multivariate correlation, but at the simplest level, 2 things move together. Okay, so height and age would be correlated, right? As we age, we tend to get taller. So if we plotted age of the US population, height of the US population, we'd see a very strong correlation. But it doesn't imply that there's a cause. So I'll give you like my favorite glib example, which is not mine, by the way. I'm blanking on the... I did hear somebody tell this once, and I thought it was funny. If you plotted on the x-axis shoe size, and on the y-axis reading comprehension, you'd have a very strong correlation. A shockingly strong, much stronger than this, by the way. Is there anybody in this room who honestly thinks that your shoe size determines your reading comprehension? You all dismissed it outright as idiotic. Now you may not know why, but I'm going to tell you why in a second. But your logical processes said, obviously, the guy with bigger feet doesn't imply he's a better reader. But it is a very strong correlation. The problem is there's a confounder. And that's the problem with epidemiology. It's this little dirty thing called confounders. So what's the confounder of shoe size? Age. It's age. Shoe size is an amazing proxy for age. And age is certainly correlated with reading comprehension through, by the way, I might add, another confounder. Age in and of itself does not tell you anything about reading comprehension. But age is a proxy for education. The longer you've lived, the more you should be educated. Now think about that for a moment, right? It's a simple, silly, glib example, but it's important to illustrate how complicated epidemiology can be. Shoe size, reading comprehension, very strong correlation. But the jugular issue is why? It's probably because the bigger your shoe size, the older you are. The older you are, the more you've been to school. The more you've been to school, the better you read. If you don't understand everything in that link, you can very quickly come to an erroneous decision about the A and the B statement, or the alpha and the omega statement. And what I'm about to argue here is that that's exactly what happened here. I have no doubt that the more fat that was in somebody's diet, the more likely they were to die of heart disease, notwithstanding all the other limitations. Take away all the death certificate stuff. There is no way that I could imagine that more people in the United States didn't die of heart disease than in Japan, and that they weren't eating a hell of a lot more fat. The question is that the cause? Or is that simply a confounder? Was there something else that the Americans were eating more of, or the Japanese were eating less of? Now, any of you been to Japan? I mean, anybody been to Japan like 30 years ago? Not today? Right. How different is their diet from ours? Significant, right. Today it's becoming tragically less different from ours. The same is true with China. The same is true with many parts of the world. So to suggest that there's one thing that made this difference, absent all others, is a little bit naive. So that's sort of, okay. So in 1952, this was prior to these studies, by the way, but just after the observation, Ancel Keys came back and presented his hypothesis at the World Health Organization meeting in Amsterdam and said that fatty diet raised serum cholesterol, caused atherosclerosis, and myocardial infarction. Now, interesting to note, he was originally ridiculed for that. So in the early 1950s, the cardiology community thought this was kind of silly. Right? It was a new idea. It seemed really silly. But they were more convinced by the graphs that I showed you earlier. So much so that by 1961, the American Heart Association released a 4-page report that now included Keys' conclusions, that the best scientific evidence of the time strongly suggests that Americans would reduce their risk of heart disease by reducing the fats in their diet and replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. Now, I have a copy of this in my office. There are a handful of copies of Time magazine I'd like to have framed to sort of remind me of how we got here, and this is one of them. In 1961, Keys was on the cover of Time magazine, and in this he recommended that the ideal heart-healthy diet should be almost 70% carbohydrate and only 15% fat. Now remember, at the time, Americans were consuming about 42% of their calories from fat. This is a big change, which you'd want to believe has big science supporting it. Okay, so let's talk about the competing philosophies. Now you remember I alluded at the beginning of the talk to sort of a sea change that really kicked off. There was something that's significant that happened in 1977. So what was it? It was something called the final report, or what's called the Dietary Goals for the United States, was released. This is more commonly referred to as the McGovern Committee. The formal name for the committee was the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Health and Human Needs. This was a committee that was formed in 1968. It was originally formed to study malnutrition in the South. However, by the early 1970s, as this debate was heating up, their focus shifted from malnutrition to the role of fat and heart disease. Now, by 1977, Congress became very impatient and insisted that a report be issued. And I just want to share with you sort of two polarizing views, or two opposite views on that panel. The first by the chair of the panel, which was George McGovern, who argued when the scientists pushed back, many of the scientists pushed back in 1977 and said, we do not have sufficient evidence to make a recommendation one way or the other. And McGovern, who was, of course, feeling pressure from Congress, who were basically saying, you need to issue a report now, this thing's been going on for 9 years, enough is enough, said, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in. Now, on the opposing side of that was Philip Handler, the president of the National Academy of Science. He said, what right has the federal government to propose that the American people conduct a vast nutritional experiment with themselves as subjects on the strength of so little evidence? So you know how the story ended. Okay, let's go through it again in some more detail. So let's talk a little bit about selection bias. Ancel Keys, by the late 1950s, was the dominant figure in this space. Now, you know, I never got to meet Ancel Keys. He died sort of not that long ago, probably 2005 if I recall, maybe 2000. But I've spoken with many people who have met him, who have interviewed him. Apparently a very charismatic, charming, good-looking guy. You know, there's something to be said for a story being told by someone who fits that description, right? It's easier to hear it. And so, you know, by the late 1950s, as I said, he really became the de facto authority on this. And he said, look, each new research adds detail, reduces areas of uncertainty, and so far provides further reasons to believe. This was in a 1957 publication of that first 5-country study. But of course, there's so many examples that ran counter to that it became so, you know, it became sort of the cult of ignoring those. Now, we're going to talk in great detail about the Framingham Heart Study later on, so don't worry if you don't know what that is, but I'll just suggest to you that there were some positive data in that study. The Framingham Heart Study found a link between cholesterol level in the blood and heart disease. But there were also lots of negative data. In women over 50, cholesterol had no predictive value of heart disease. Furthermore, unpublished negative data showed that in Framingham they compared the diets of men whose cholesterol was over 300, that's a pretty high level, 300 milligrams per deciliter, to the diets of men in the bottom 5%, 170 milligrams per deciliter. And it actually found no relationship between the highest and the lowest amount of cholesterol in people's blood and how much fat and cholesterol they ate. That's pretty interesting. But that didn't consider, that wasn't part of the story. And the authors noted that there is considerable range of serum cholesterol within the Framingham study group. Something explains this inter-individual variation, but it is not the diet as measured here. Now again, think about it. What's going on in 1968? The diet heart hypothesis says you eat fat, you get heart disease. There's a nuance I'll just point out because it's worth mentioning. So the difference between cholesterol and fat is significant, right? So eating cholesterol is not the same as eating fat. Even Ancel Keys himself, by the way, felt that eating cholesterol did not raise cholesterol. And that is correct. That's something I would take to the bank tomorrow, right? So the cholesterol that we eat, like that which is in eggs and shellfish and stuff, doesn't really even make it into our system because of a chemical reason. It has something called a esterified side chain on it, and we can't absorb sterols with side chains on them. So most of the cholesterol you eat comes right out of your body immediately. And even Ancel Keys acknowledged that back in the day. But nevertheless, at the time, a very interesting question was, does the amount of cholesterol and or fat that we eat raise our serum cholesterol, which we think is causing heart disease? But there was lots of other epidemiologic evidence that countered the original observation by Keys. Remember, Keys had a very specific criteria for looking at it, but when you looked at other subpopulations, not countries, because he was doing this at a country level, but when you looked at Benedictine and Trappist monks, Navajo Indians, the Irish immigrants to Boston, the Swiss alpine farmers, the Maasai, other African pastoralites, it found no association between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. In other words, there were countless counterexamples, even to the epidemiology. But amazingly, Keys rejected them as having no relevance to the diet, cholesterol, coronary heart disease relationships in other populations. I mean, it's another way of doing something that I think we all tend to do anyway, and you know, that's sort of why you want to have people around you to keep you honest, which is when you see data that counter your belief, you reject it. So let's revisit selection bias. So in 1957, Oglesby, Paul, and his colleagues at the University of Chicago conducted a study. This was a non-intervention study, a purely observational study of 5,400 male employees of the Western Electric Company. Now, they spent their time focusing on the 15% of men who self-reported eating the least amount of fat to the 15% of men who reported eating the highest amount of fat. So again, when you're doing epidemiology, sometimes you want to create the greatest signal, so you look at the most extremes on both ends. So for 4.5 years, with no intervention, they just prospectively followed the men who ate the most fat and the men who ate the least fat. And at the end of 4.5 years, they said, how many people have died of heart disease? And at the end of 4.5 years, 88 men in that cohort had died of heart disease. 14 of them were in the high-fat group, and 16 were in the low-fat group. Doesn't seem suggestive that eating a high-fat diet is causing heart disease. They returned 15 years later and followed up the observation. And it turned out to be the exact same. At 15 years, I'm sorry, yeah, it was 15 years. It might have been a little longer. I think it was 15 years. There was no difference. So the numbers got bigger because obviously more time for people to die, but there was no difference between them. And so the authors concluded that the amount of saturated fatty acids in the diets was not significantly associated with the risk of death from coronary heart disease. Okay. By the way, I went back and looked at all these papers because you kind of want to read, you don't just want to read the news clippings, you want to read the actual papers. So, this is a quote directly from the paper that was published in JAMA in 1981. And they rationalized in the discussion section. Although most attempts to document the relationship of dietary cholesterol, saturated fatty acids, and polyunsaturated fatty acids to serum cholesterol concentration in persons who are eating freely have been unsuccessful, positive test results have been obtained in 4 investigations besides the Western Electric study. Well, first of all, the Western Electric study was not successful. It didn't show that. They rationalized further in the same paper. If viewed in isolation, the conclusions that can be drawn from a single epidemiologic study are limited. Within the context of the total literature, however, the present observations support the conclusions that the fat composition of the diet affects the level of serum cholesterol and the long-term risk from death from coronary heart disease in middle-aged American men. They may be talking about a paper I was not able to read. And the media pounced all over this. The Washington Post said, the new report strongly reinforces the view that a high-fat, high-cholesterol diet can clog arteries and cause heart disease. This obviously also reflects our complete lack of understanding of how atherosclerosis works. It has nothing to do with clogging arteries, but it sure sounds good, right? Eating fat, clogging arteries. And one of the authors in the New York Times noted that the message of these findings is that it is prudent to decrease the amount of saturated fats and cholesterol in your diet. Amazingly, over the next decade, as a bunch of other things unfolded, this talk is not told chronologically. I'm going to jump back and forth, so I'm following a thread of the Western Electric study, then we're going to come back. So keep the timeline in mind. By 1990, the denouement, the nail in the coffin, was when the AHA and the NHLBI co-authored a report called The Cholesterol Facts. And they included the Western Electric study as one of 7 epidemiologic studies showing the link between diet and coronary heart disease that have produced particularly impressive results in showing a correlation between saturated fatty acids and coronary heart disease, which is precisely what it did not do. Let's go back to the 70s. Let's talk about the state of the evidence. So remember, in 1970, so you had in 1961, the AHA releases the ad hoc committee, the 4-page report based on Ansel Keys' 1957 study. Now we go forward to 1970. Now this has really become, there's been a complete 180 in the AHA. The American Heart Association Committee now recommends a low saturated fat diet, less than 10% of calories, for every American, including infants, children, adolescents, lactating and pregnant women, and older persons. Remember, today, what are we down to? 7, according to the second from last, 5 to 6% on the last. So we're getting much more aggressive. Now, this wasn't lost on a handful of observers, right? There were a handful of people sort of sitting back in the peanut gallery saying, WTF? right? So Henry Blackburn wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine, two strikingly polar attitudes persist on this subject, with much talk from each and little listening between. Another author commented in the New England Journal of Medicine, it must still be admitted that the diet-heart relationship is an unproven hypothesis that needs more investigation. Now, of course, this was written 1 year after it was basically carved in stone with the dietary goals for Americans. So let's look at some clinical trials. So I just pull up these two because they're basically the exact same experiment and they show different results, and it's not clear which one's right? So in 1963, a group of Hungarian researchers reported that if you limited the consumption of fat in high-risk men to 1.5 ounces per day, that's a really small amount. That's like 45 grams of fat a day, total fat a day. There was some benefit in reducing the risk of heart disease. And about the same time, a British group was doing a slightly more controlled experiment because they looked at men, so that's a higher risk population, so they were looking at men who had already suffered an MI, and they did the same thing. They limited them to 1.5 ounces of fat per day, and actually the group that had less fat had a higher risk of recurrent heart disease. So they reported a low-fat diet has no place in the treatment of myocardial infarction. So again, that doesn't sound to me like a settled science. You could make an argument from that. We have no idea what the answer is, but it certainly doesn't sound like a settled science. Perhaps one of the greatest tragedies in this entire story is this study. It's a tragedy for a couple of reasons. So in 1973, the Minnesota Coronary study was initiated. This had 9,000 men and women. This was a very good study in that, again, I don't even know if it would be ethical to do this today, but at the time it was done in 6 mental institutions in Minnesota. So the reason that's of note is because you actually could control what the patient was eating. Right? So most of these studies are based on you telling me what you ate, which if I picked on one of you right now and said, tell me what you ate last Monday a week ago, like how well do you think you'd do? Yeah, pretty crappy. So you could make an argument that much of the scientific underpinning of this is pretty lousy. But the Minnesota Heart Study is interesting because it took 9,000 men and women across these 6 institutions over a period of 4.5 years, and they actually were fed the diets of the prescription. So the treatment arm for this was a 9% saturated fat intake. So they dramatically reduced the intake of saturated fat to 9%. In the control arm, they consumed 18% saturated fat. So both groups contained about the same amount of fat, but the treatment group said, we're going to take saturated fat down to near nothing. In the control arm, they just ate more mono and polyunsaturated fat. So they were eating about the same stuff. So that's actually pretty good in science when you can create a clean experiment where one group, basically you just change the one variable. The total cholesterol in the group on the low-fat diet over 4.5 years went from 207 to 175. So eating less fat did lower their cholesterol from 207 to 175. And in the treatment group, it went from that average of 207 to about 203. So very little change. But there was no difference at all after 4.5 years in heart disease or overall mortality. So I started by saying this was a real tragedy. Why? So you can see 269 deaths in the intervention group, 206 deaths in the control. That was not statistically significant, though it almost looks like more people were dying in the low-fat group. The tragedy of this is that this study, which completed in 1973, was not published until 1989. And when the principal investigator was asked why, his response was, we were disappointed in the way the results turned out. Now, to me, that's a great tragedy because that says that was a very important 16 years in the history of this debate. And one of the best studies that, certainly from a control level, was able to address some of these questions basically got, it was hiding in some guy's office in the University of Minnesota. I have often wondered, and again, I'm just asserting a bias here, I've often wondered how much of that had to do with the fact that Ansel Keys was also at the University of Minnesota, and this was in Minnesota. I don't know. I have no insight into that, but But it's certainly, as a skeptic, that's sort of as the conspiracy theorist, I would argue that. Okay, so what was the tipping point? Well, I kind of already alluded to this. The tipping point really came in 1977 when Congress insisted to Senator McGovern that the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Health and Human Needs release its findings. And so they did. If you recall, you had Philip Handler and many others on the opposing side of this saying, we are not ready to issue guidelines. In fact, this is irresponsible behavior. And then you had a political system that said, we better know something. And I can relate to both of those, right? I spend most of my time these days, if I'm not fundraising, I'm trying to educate policymakers about the need to pay attention to this problem. And again, I think it's understandable that they operate through a lens of just tell me the best thing I can do right now, right? I accept that the information may be incomplete, but certainly there must be something to do that is the best we can do now. So again, I don't think this is nefarious. I think it's easy to demonize McGovern, and there may be things to demonize him for, but I don't think this is one. I think the desire to get an answer is a legitimate and understandable need to sort of prevent death, but it has an unintended consequence. And so the two recommendations put forth by the committee was to increase carbohydrate consumption to 55 to 60% of calories and to reduce fat consumption to 30% of calories. Now, the reason you have to increase your consumption of carbohydrates is if you're taking away fat, you have to put something back in. Now, interestingly, and again, it's almost like each slide of this talk is a separate book, right? So there's an entire series of books just on this and the politics behind it. But one of the interesting things was another recommendation they had that really got buried was that Americans limit their consumption of sugar. It turned out that the lobbying forces that existed of the day made it pretty clear that that one was going to sort of get swept aside. And Gary Taubes, who's my co-founder at NuSI, actually went back and interviewed the person who was sort of like the, I don't know what the exact term is for the person, but the person who basically wrote the report. You know, it's sort of a junior person that would have been in McGovern's office, the staff person who would have done all the heavy lifting. And he interviewed this person, and he said at the day of the hearing, when they all sort of parted ways, someone from the sugar industry came up to him and said, you know, you guys just put these recommendations out there, and what you implied or what you wanted to happen was that eat more carbohydrates means eat more fruits and vegetables. But he goes, in fact, what you guys just did was you opened up a Pandora's box for an entirely new culture of food, an entirely new engineered food product, which, of course, many of you know how that will go. So there was certainly debate at the time about whether this was the right thing to do, but I want to share with you what's called the fallback position, or the precautionary principle. So Mark Hegsted, who was then at Harvard University and was a member of this committee, said the question to be asked is not why should we change our diet, but why not? There are no risks that can be identified, and important benefits can be expected. His argument being, look, I admit we might not know for certain that fat is causing heart disease, but could there possibly be any harm from taking it out of our diet? Well, it depends what you substitute in, doesn't it? So let's look at the cohort studies. Okay, now we're going to have a little discussion about Framingham, which is pretty interesting. This is where my personal favorite part of the story is this part, because this is like how Lipidology 101 got run amok. So in the early 1970s, the NIH became very interested in understanding more about this cholesterol heart disease business. And remember at the time, you had Ansel Keys doing all this thing on total cholesterol level, right? But it became clear through some studies that the techniques had been developed to look at what's called gel electrophoresis. You could start to separate out those proteins that carry cholesterol. And it became clear that they were different densities. In particular, they saw one that was of low density, what we now call LDL. And they believed that that, in particular, was the critical part of cholesterol that may be responsible for heart disease. So in what was at the time unprecedented, the NIH funded a very large cohort study to look at the specific question of these fractions of cholesterol. In other words, could we do better at predicting heart disease by understanding elevations in certain subsets or subclasses of cholesterol? So to do this, they did what's called a cohort study. So they looked at 5 cohorts. Now, Framingham is the one you've probably all heard of, the Framingham study, right? So everyone's heard of Framingham. But there were 4 others. So there was Framingham, there was Albany, Honolulu, Puerto Rico, San Francisco. And there were 2 separate studies that were done. The first one was done looking at 900 patients in those 5 cohorts who had a coronary event, so major adverse coronary event, and 900 matched controls from their cohort. So you now had 1,800 people. Half of them have had a coronary event, half of them have not, across these 5 cohorts. And we studied the blood of all of them. Now, at the time, you couldn't actually measure LDL cholesterol. You could measure total cholesterol. You could measure something that they weren't interested in called high-density lipoprotein, HDL cholesterol. And you could measure triglyceride. And a very clever formula links those. It turns out total cholesterol is approximated by all the high-density cholesterol, all the low-density cholesterol, and all the very low-density cholesterol. Now, high-density, so you're trying to solve for the LDL one. So it's sort of like an, A equals B plus C plus D. If you can get 3 of those, you're going to get the 4th using simple algebra. Here's the algebra. We can measure total cholesterol. Remember, Ansel Keys even knew how to do that 10, 15 years earlier. They had figured out how to measure high-density HDL cholesterol. You could measure triglyceride, which it turned out is a pretty good proxy for VLDL if you divide it by 5. It's about 20%. A simple rearranging of the equation allows you to calculate, not measure, calculate LDL cholesterol. And so the investigators set out to do that. So they measured total cholesterol, triglyceride, and HDL cholesterol in all of these people. They didn't really care about any of those things because they calculated LDL. Then what they did was they took those results and in a prospective Framingham cohort of, I want to say 1,800 people, 2,000 people, they did a predictive observational study going forward in Framingham using those metrics. So in other words, you test it here, you validate it here. And here's what they found. Elevated level of LDL cholesterol was a marginal factor for risk. It turned out that a low HDL was the single greatest predictor of cardiovascular risk in men and women of every single age, from 30 to 80 years old. And it turned out that elevated triglyceride, which almost always goes hands in hand with low HDL. If your HDL is high, your trigs are usually low. If your trigs are high, your HDL is always low. It turned out that elevated triglyceride was almost equally strong in predicting cardiovascular risk in all but one subgroup, and I believe it was women under 50. It had no predictive bearing or something like that. But the point is you had low HDL, high triglyceride being far and away the better predictors of heart disease risk, and LDL being elevated only turned out to have some reliability for men and women over 50, and even there it was about a quarter as strong as the HDL and LDL story. 2 caveats worth mentioning. It is well documented, well known, nobody will argue this. Saturated fat raises HDL. Carbohydrates lower it. Back when I was a fat guy, my HDL, when I was a carbivore, when I was a 70% carb loading swimmer guy, my HDL was like 31, which actually qualified me as having metabolic syndrome. I was blown away over the next 2 years as I continued to tweak my diet, how much I could manipulate my HDL cholesterol. I could literally get it, at one point I got it as high as 85. And again, this is not pharmacologic, this is just through dietary intervention, and it really held true to this point, right? So, many of you are saying, well, wait a minute, if all this was published in 1977, why didn't this impact the story? Well, the authors of that paper concluded things that raise HDL should be considered to reduce the risk of heart disease. So this is 1977. This story went effectively ignored and unnoticed until the mid-90s. And again, I think it's maybe, now that I think about it, this may be the greatest tragedy. I think the Minnesota Heart Study becomes the second greatest. So why is that? Well, you see, at the time, prior to the publication of this, the NIH had already launched 2 enormous studies investigating the role of LDL cholesterol in heart disease. These studies were huge. In yesterday's dollars, these were $250 million studies. In today's dollars, these were over $500 million in 2 studies that went forward. So this story got completely ignored. In fact, there's a great interview with the lead author on that paper, Gordon, explaining how he took these findings to the NIH after the publication of the Framingham study and presented this to the group, and they basically looked at him as though this was completely irrelevant, uninteresting, and why are you telling us this? The guy that resurrected this was a guy who's actually still alive today named Jerry Reaven at Stanford, and in the mid-90s he observed something, which was there's a cluster of metabolic findings that seem to predict heart disease, diabetes, stroke, cancer, Alzheimer's disease far better than anything else. And they are obviously truncal obesity, so waist, and he had cutoffs, so for men it was more than 40 inches, for women more than 36 inches, elevated blood pressure, elevated glucose, fasting glucose elevation. What are the other 2? Anybody know? Low HDL, high triglyceride. No mention of LDL. That syndrome, which was referred to as Syndrome X, is now referred to as metabolic syndrome. You've all heard of it. Metabolic syndrome is you have 3 of those 5, your risk of the metabolic diseases just went through the roof. So it really wasn't until Reaven came back and looked at this that it became clear that the story always really should have been about HDL and triglycerides. The LDL story is, while certainly more nuanced than I'm going to be able to get into today, was really the second tier story. There was a little bit of cognitive dissonance here too. I think it was very hard for people who had been hardwired to believe cholesterol is bad to imagine that there could be a subfraction of cholesterol that is not bad. Because at the end of the day, high density cholesterol is just another type of lipoprotein that's carrying the same cholesterol. The thought that that could somehow be good just created sort of a cognitive dissonant moment in people, and I think largely resulted in the dismissal of this thesis. Okay, so let's go back to the 2 studies that were being launched while the Framingham thing was going on. So the first was Mr. Fit. This was a study that, as you can see, $115 million back in the 1970s. In today's dollars, this is about $250 million study. This was a 7-year study that looked at, it's been a while since I've read this one, so I'm going to go back and 13,000 high-risk men only, age 35 to 57. This was a non-drug study. This was a dietary intervention study. So in this study, they randomized them into 2 groups. The first group was a control. The second group was, I'm sorry, I said it was a non-drug study. I sort of misspoke. There was only drugs used for hypertension. So in the treatment arm, the participants were instructed to stop smoking. They were given medication to control their blood pressure, and they were advised to consume a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet. So all that sort of makes sense, right? So go on a low-fat diet, stop smoking, control your blood pressure, and you guys over here just keep on doing what you're doing. And after 7 years, the intervention group had 41.2 deaths per 1,000 versus 40.4 deaths in the controls. There was no significant difference. And so this was viewed as the negative study that said, and you can see the title in the Wall Street Journal, Heart Attack, a Test Collapses. This was viewed as sort of a challenge to this hypothesis. Turned out the other study had a much greater impact. So this was the Lipid Research Clinic Coronary Primary Prevention Trial. I'll just refer to it as the LRC because I can't say that all the time. So the LRC, which was even a more expensive study, and this was also a pharmacologic intervention. So this study looked at 3,800 men who had elevated cholesterol, elevated blood cholesterol. But these men were asymptomatic. They weren't as high risk as the first group. This was double-blinded. The intervention here was twofold. Was diet eat less fat, eat less cholesterol, and a new class of medication called a bile acid sequestrant. Has anybody heard of bile acid sequestrants? They sort of set the stage for what became some of the biggest blockbuster drugs in the world, which are statins. So prior to statins, which reduce cholesterol by limiting the critical enzyme step in cholesterol synthesis called HMG-CoA reductase, bile acid sequestrants were a much more crude way to lower cholesterol in the blood. Most cholesterol in our body is actually made by our body, but it gets circulated. So it gets made in our body. The lipoproteins carry it from the cells that make it to other cells. And most of it winds up going back to the liver. The liver packages cholesterol in lipoproteins and secretes it in bile. Bile ends up going through our GI tract, and in our gut, we reabsorb a fraction of that cholesterol. And so the cycle continues. So the bile acid sequestrant is the crudest way to get cholesterol out of the body. It sequesters and binds the bile acids in your GI tract and basically makes sure that more cholesterol is leaving your body through your stool than is getting repurposed and recirculated. So make no mistake about it, bile acid sequestrants, they worked. They will lower all of the cholesterol in your body, the good, the bad, the ugly. They're largely out of favor today because the side effects tend to be pretty miserable, and now that drugs are much more sophisticated, they're not used as often. But nevertheless, they work. So this study took 3,800 asymptomatic men who did have elevated cholesterol, and it randomized them into two groups. The first group on the sort of low-fat, low-cholesterol diet and a bile acid sequestrant. The second group on a placebo control. I actually gave a talk at the University of Minnesota 2 years ago, and a man came up to me after and said, I was one of the subjects in that study. And so I've got a great picture with me and him standing there with like one of these guys. And so to this day, I don't think he ever found out if he got placebo or control. So nevertheless, at the end of this study, the 10-year mortality was 35.8 per 1,000 in the intervention group, the treatment group, versus 37.3 deaths per 1,000 in the control group, which, by the way, if you do the math on that, what's the absolute risk reduction? Virtually zero. Right? Virtually zero. But it was statistically significant. Not necessarily clinically significant, it was statistically significant. But of course, this was hailed as, sorry, it's true, cholesterol really is a killer. Now, remember how I said I collect magazines? This is one I bet many of you would remember in a moment. It's the one with the eggs and the bacon sad face. That's from this study. Okay, so the authors concluded appropriately in the paper as follows. Caution should be exercised before extrapolating the LRC findings to cholesterol-lowering drugs other than bile acid sequestrants. Very prudent thing to say, right? All this study told us is that a bile acid sequestrant with this dietary intervention did better than nothing. Doesn't mean that another drug that lowers cholesterol. Okay, it's a very prudent thing to say. The LRC was not designed to assess directly whether cholesterol lowering by diet prevents coronary heart disease. I feel like Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, I completely agree with that, right? Okay. Now, Basil Rifkind, who was the NIH director of the LRC, took it one step further. It is now indisputable that lowering cholesterol with diet and drugs can actually cut the risk of developing heart disease and having a heart attack. Yeah, I think I still agree with that. I'm not sure about the diet part, but okay, it's true it was diet-drug combo. But of course, the media, what do they care, right? I mean, it's like, what are you going to put a picture of a bile acid sequestrant on the cover of Time? Forget about it. You're going to show us some bacon and eggs, right? This has nothing to do with what the study was about, does it? Basil Rifkind goes one step further. The LRC results strongly indicate that the more you lower cholesterol and fat in your diet, the more you reduce your risk of heart disease. I feel like I'm back reading the Oglesby-Paul nonsense in the Washington Post. Where are you getting this? Right? Where are you getting this? Right? This is the limit of scientific evidence. This is the ethics of dietary guidelines. Tell me where you're getting that from. Because it sure as hell isn't from anything you've shown us. It sure as hell isn't from any of the data. It sure as hell isn't from a single experiment that's been done. Gary had the opportunity to interview Basil before his death in 2002. And he asked him that very question. His answer, it's an imperfect world. The data that would be definitive is ungettable. So you do your best with what's available. I don't know. I don't find that acceptable, personally. Yeah. In 1984, the NIH Consensus Conference, which was headed by Basil Rifkin, took place in Bethesda, Maryland. Again, one of the beauties of giving these talks is you always meet somebody interesting who adds a little bit to the history. I gave this talk as a grand round once at UCSD, and a woman came up to me after and said, I was one of the members of the consensus panel. I later validated this. I looked up who she was, and sure enough, she's a very prominent person, and she was, I think she's an endocrinologist. She was part of the panel, and she gave me the behind-the-scenes version of what actually happened at the NIH consensus panel, which was they got brought into a room in Bethesda, they got sat down, and they got told, this is the consensus, sign it. And they fought and disagreed for a day and a half until they finally just agreed and signed it. But there was nothing about a consensus here. This was sort of, you're not getting out of this room until you sign it. So the conclusion from the NIH consensus statement was there is no doubt that a low-fat diet, no doubt. There's like nothing, I can't say that about anything, except maybe like gravity. Like, I'm pretty sure if I jump off this stage, I will hit the ground. I'm so confident, in fact, I don't even need to do it. That is no doubt. Pretty much everything else in my life, there's doubt. But there is no doubt that a low-fat diet will afford significant protection against coronary heart disease to every American over the age of 2. Well, as the co-PI of the LRC study, Dan Steinberg, put it, if there had been a real consensus, you wouldn't have had to have had a consensus conference. A few years later, the National Academy of Science issued its tome, which stated that the highest priority is given to reducing fat intake because the scientific evidence concerning dietary fats and other lipids and human health is strongest, and the likely impact on public health is the greatest. And ladies and gentlemen, that's effectively how the story ended, right? Within a year, Nabisco had created a new product. And this goes back to what that staff person for McGovern was told in 1977. You guys think people are just going to eat a whole bunch more fruits and vegetables when you tell them not to eat fat? Keep thinking that, buddy. We're going to figure out something that is fat-free, cholesterol-free, and has no sodium in it. Don't even get me started on the sodium story. It's just as bad as this one. And we laugh about it now because Snackwells is so JV. I mean, who eats these things? They're probably disgusting. But at the day, this was a revolution. See, now you've got Chobani yogurt instead, right? You've got all this other really good low-fat stuff. And if any of you have ever heard Rob Lustig talk, which I would never even try to speak to this like Rob does, I mean, low-fat is code for what? High sugar, right? The Webster's might as well just call them synonyms. Low-fat, high sugar. It's the same thing, okay? When I say low-fat, do you think broccoli? No. All right. So what's happened since the consensus? So the consensus was, by 1990, the game was over, right? I only talked about, I focused more on the proponents of this. There's a huge group of opponents. There's a huge group of people who fought the good fight and lost, if you believe, as I believe, that this was the wrong decision. So let's look at the evidence post-consensus. So let's start with the Cochrane collaboration, which has done 3 meta-analyses on this topic. Anyone not familiar, or I guess, is everybody familiar with the Cochrane collaboration? Okay. So the Cochrane collaboration in 2001 released its first meta-analysis on this topic, reduced or modified dietary fat for preventing cardiovascular disease. They looked at 27 well-controlled RCTs with 10,000 subjects in total, followed for an average of 3 years each. And they noted that the reduction of dietary fat had no effect on longevity and no significant effect on cardiovascular events. In 2006, they released a second meta-analysis titled Multiple Risk Factor Intervention for Primary Prevention of Coronary Heart Disease. So this didn't look at only dietary fat. It looked at drugs. It looked at blood, smoking cessation, blood pressure reduction, things like that. It looked at 10 well-controlled trials with nearly 1 million patient years of intervention. and it said the pooled effects suggest multiple risk factor intervention has no effect on mortality. Again, that's kind of a shocking statement. This was reissued and updated 3 years ago, and now they looked at, they included 55 new trials, short-term trials of 6 and 12-month duration. And they said, again, contrary to expectations, multiple risk factor interventions had little or no impact on the risk of coronary heart disease, morbidity, or mortality. The largest prospective study ever conducted in nutrition, the Women's Health Initiative, which was published in 2006. This is a study that looked at nearly 50,000 postmenopausal women. They were randomized 60-40, so 60% of them, about 30,000, were in the treatment group. The treatment group was instructed to significantly reduce their consumption of saturated fat, to increase their consumption of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. The treatment group, the control group was obviously a control, eat the standard American high-fat diet. After 6 years, the total fat consumption was reduced by 8.2%. Saturated fat was reduced by 2.9%. So the treatment group, let's see if I have my note on this. I think the treatment group did not get below 10% saturated fat. So about a 3%, it might have been something like 10.5%, 13.5%. There was also, of course, as some of you probably know, but not to be confused with this is not the hormonal treatment. So the Women's Health Initiative was primarily an HRT trial, but there was a separate nutrition trial, which is the one we're talking about. So interestingly, the average follow-up was 5.7 years. The intervention group, the low-fat, high fruits and vegetables, high grains group, did not reduce the risk of heart disease or stroke. The low-fat dietary pattern did not result in a statistically significant reduction in the risk of invasive breast cancer. There was no evidence that the low-fat dietary pattern reduced colorectal cancer, and there was no evidence that it reduced the risk of diabetes. So it failed on every metric to reduce what they were trying to reduce. Now again, whenever you see data like this, you can spin it any way you want, and the reality of it is I don't know the answer in the Women's Health Initiative. I really don't. Out of the gate, one of the biggest problems with the Women's Health Initiative is it was a free-living study with relatively poor compliance. So don't know what to make of that. The authors argued that the reason the study was negative was it wasn't long enough. 5.7 years, they argued, was not long enough to see a reduction in heart disease. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But it seems to me that every time this hypothesis gets tested, it comes up sort of empty-handed. Christopher Gardner did a study in 2007 called the A2Z trial. Now, Christopher is an interesting guy, and I should just be completely transparent. Our organization, Nutrition Science Initiative, is currently funding a study that Christopher Gardner and John Ioannidis are conducting at Stanford University, which is actually a follow-up to this study. But nevertheless, this study in 2007 took about 320 pre-menopausal women and randomized them into 4 groups. And the hypothesis that Christopher wanted to test was, is it the carbs or the fat that's primarily responsible for weight loss and or metabolic dysregulation? And so he designed what I thought was a very elegant study at the time, especially on such a shoestring budget, which was creating 4 arms, each of which basically embraced a popular diet. And each one then had basically a gradation of fat content and carbohydrate content inversely. So on the one end of the spectrum, you had the Atkins diet, which of course everybody knows is a very low carbohydrate diet that obviously by extension increases the consumption of fat. And at the other end of the spectrum, you had the Ornish diet, which is very low in fat and conversely very high in carbohydrates. You had the Zone diet, which is sort of a moderate carb-restricted diet, and then the Learn diet, which is sort of like a USDA DASH type balanced diet, if you will. Now note, all of these diets are significant improvement if followed to the letter over the standard American diet, because even the Ornish diet, though it's very high in carbs, is very particular about what kind of carbs you can consume. There's no flour, there's no refined grain, there's no sugar. If we have time and anybody's interested, because some people are interested, just for the sake of time, I sort of don't talk about Dean Ornish's study because it's a relatively small study, but in 1991 he did publish a study in Lancet that looked at the reversal of heart disease on his diet. And if anybody's interested, maybe if we have Q&A, I can talk through that. But nevertheless, this was sort of the study. So you can see, just under 80 patients per arm. And at the end of the year, you can see that the people on the Atkins group had the greatest reduction in weight, the greatest reduction in triglyceride, and, I'm sorry, that's at 2 months. This is what I really wanted to show you. At 1 year, the greatest reduction in weight, the greatest reduction in triglyceride, the greatest increase in HDL. And for what it's worth, the greatest reduction in blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure. So this was a very counterintuitive finding. It was also counterintuitive because Christopher Gardner is a vegan. So, you can always look at these studies, and you always have to be a little skeptical of people with their own agendas, right? And that's why NuSI, for example, doesn't do research, right? I mean, Gary and I, who founded NuSI, have very strong bias. Well, you don't want to see research I'm doing, right? So you'd rather see independent and skeptical people doing the research. And similarly, I think Gardner's about as skeptical as they come, especially because his own personal dietary philosophy is one of a vegan diet. And so it was very surprising both to Gardner and I think to the nutrition community when he published a study that said actually the Atkins diet had the best result across the board. And he took a lot of flack for that. Another follow-up trial was the diet workplace trial by Shai. I think this was 300 subjects in this study. 322 study. This was a 2-year study which looked at the following. So you had a calorie-restricted, fat-reduced diet. You had a calorie-restricted Mediterranean diet, and you had an ad libitum low-carbohydrate diet. So the calorie-restricted means you give the subject a calorie target. We want you to eat 1,600 calories per day. The ad libitum says we want you to eat until you are satiated. Don't bother counting calories. Just eat as you feel comfortable. So you can see, like all dietary studies, you had a great improvement initially, and then everybody sort of probably slips a little bit. There's some recidivism. And by the end of that study, in body weight, this is body weight, there was no difference between the low-carb and the Mediterranean group, but both were statistically more significant in weight loss than the low-fat group. When you look at the biomarkers, now here, if it's colored in red, it tells you it's significant within the group from its baseline. If it's colored in blue, it tells you it's also significant with respect to the other group. So here you can see all of them reduced their blood pressure so significantly from baseline, but no difference between each other, both systolically and diastolically. Nothing was significant in the LDL cholesterol reduction except for the Mediterranean group. Only the HDL cholesterol group, even though they all raised significantly, the carbohydrate restriction, i.e. those people eating the most fat, had the greatest increase in HDL cholesterol relative to the others. And the same is true for the reduction in triglycerides. And again, if you believe as I do that from a standard cholesterol panel, and I'm very interested in advanced testing, so all of this is really proxies for what's actually going on, which most people aren't measuring. But from the proxy standpoint, we saw repeatedly, I hope today, that these two things are probably far more predictive of your risk of heart disease than this one. Greatest reduction, the only one to have a significant reduction in in hemoglobin A1C, a measure of glycemic control, and C-reactive protein, a marker of inflammation. And very recently, in fact, many of you may have seen this. This was in the New York Times a month ago. Another study in the Annals of Internal Medicine took just under 150 obese men and women. So these were all BMI above 30. Without coronary heart disease, and they randomized them to a low-carbohydrate diet versus a low-fat diet. So the goal in the low-carb arm was to stay under 40 grams per day. From personal experience, I will say that's really hard. The goal of the low-fat diet was to keep total fat below 30% and saturated fat below 7%. This was a 1-year intervention, and they were not quite able to get that. At 1 year, the low-carb group was at about 100 to 120 grams per day. So that's still really low, right? I mean, that means you're eating fruits and vegetables willy-nilly, but you're not having pizzas, you're not having bread, you're not having a lot of rice or pasta. The low-fat group was not able to get down to 7% saturated fat, but they were able to get down to 9%. So by contrast, the low-fat group was at 9% saturated fat. The low-carb group was about 13.5% saturated fat. So there is a difference between those two. Now, there was a significant reduction in weight. The primary outpoint of this was weight and then cardiovascular disease endpoints. And so the the dotted line is the low-carb group. So the low-carb group actually gained lean mass. I don't have a graph for overall weight, but their overall weight reduction was greater. There was actually no change in their LDL cholesterol. The low carbohydrate, high fat group had a greater increase in HDL cholesterol. So an ideal goal is to keep it flat. So the thing that I suggested to the New York Times reporter that was interesting in this study was the Framingham risk calculator over 1 year actually showed a decrease in the subjects on the high-fat, low-carb diet. And to me, that's actually very interesting because it's really hard to reverse time from a coronary artery disease standpoint. And you could argue the low-fat group did pretty well. Notice how theirs didn't go up that much. You know, you normally see a slightly bigger increase year to year. So I've just told you the story, and we're wrapping up here, but I just want to sort of bring it back to where we go. So I told you the story, and you're going to go home, and you're going to think about it, and you're going to think of 10 things that you're going to be like, that just seems ridiculous. Like, that guy pulled a fast one on us. There's got to be something in this story we didn't hear, because the way he presented it, it's sort of suspect at best, right? The way I like to think about it is, why was there so much cultural confidence in this dietary heart fat hypothesis? And I think it can be broken down into 2 time points, okay? I think prior to 1984, it really came from our unscientific brains' belief in a story, largely driven by epidemiology. So let's just be really clear. Everyone in this room, we all think we're smart, we get science, we know all this stuff. I want to be real clear. We are not hardwired to think scientifically. In fact, I wrote a blog post about it that's got to be my favorite blog post I've ever written, which is, I basically explain, and I can't take credit for it, it was all a buddy of mine's discussion over dinner one day that prompted me to do this, but I basically explained that it's actually evolutionarily to our disadvantage to think scientifically. It turns out only in the last couple hundred years would it be of benefit to do so, but if you go back for millions of years, it's actually not to our evolutionary advantage to think scientifically. And so to this day, even though many of us are educated and we like to think scientifically, it's very easy to revert into our primitive brains, which don't really like science. And prior to 1984, the story was so compelling. Populations that eat lots of fat get heart disease. I mean, how can you argue with that? Who cares about all the confounders, Peter, and maybe they also ate a lot of sugar because rich people had access to sugar and poor people didn't. And, well, who cares about that? If you ate fat, you got heart disease. Like, it didn't matter if you were the head of the NIH, the head of Harvard, or some schmo on the street, or a Time magazine reporter. That story makes sense. And that really accounted for the confidence. I think post-1984, it became something a little more complicated, which is we now know that drugs that lower cholesterol do lower your risk of heart disease. Now, that in and of itself is a topic that we could spend 4 hours discussing. It's much more nuanced than we want to believe. The effect is not as great as we think it is. It's probably not great in all populations. There's probably some populations in whom that's complete and utter nonsense. But more or less, we've accepted the fact that when we give people drugs that lower cholesterol, we lower their risk of heart disease. And we know that when you eat more fat, on average, your total cholesterol, and sometimes even your LDL cholesterol, goes up. The problem is nobody understands, or 1/100th of 1% of the population truly understands the relationship between the lipoproteins and the cholesterol. So the caveat is drugs and diet are not compatible. Drugs have lots of actions, as do diets. A great quote from the statistician at the University of Washington saying that statins reduce heart disease by lowering cholesterol is like saying aspirin reduces heart disease by reducing headaches. Sounds silly when you phrase it that way.